60,000 pelts were shipped to the Netherlands.
The Dutch colony of New Netherlands was among and between large groups of indigenous tribes, such as the Iroquois to the west and the Algonquin to the east. English colonists also tested Dutch claims along the Connecticut and Delaware rivers and Long Island. However, the Dutch sphere of influence did extend in the narrow strip along the Hudson River. At the southern tip of Manhattan was the major settlement of New Amsterdam, which by 1660 had about 1,500 inhabitants. Broadway extended down the west side of the settlement to Bowling Green and a fort at the southern tip of the island.
Houses along major streets formed neighborhoods of gardens, orchards, and pasture. In the 1650s, a defensive wall was built along the Hudson River in the town's northern border. The 2,000-foot wall on the north gave the street behind its name, Wall Street. The wall was first built to protect against English attacks, and several years later was extended to ward off tribal raids. Originally, the wall had 12-foot posts that supported 15-foot planks. Later, sections of the wall used a palisade of logs braced by a sawn-to-covered breastwork, allowing sentries to patrol behind the wall. Although wooden walls could repel small attacks by land, large Dutch or English warships could reduce them to splinters in just a few hours. The greatest incendiary threat to the settlement came from the Anglo-Dutch naval wars. The destruction of Manhattan was narrowly avoided more than once by timely capitulations and treaties, and resulted in the town changing its name from New Amsterdam to New York. In Europe, where large naval wars began with some regularity, coastal countries had incentives to develop advanced firefighting machines. By the late 1600s, sophisticated machines, such as those in Amsterdam, made a dramatic reduction in the destruction by fire. Not long after their introduction in England, American colonial towns, like Boston, already plagued by horrendous fires, began to import them.
In the early 1700s, Richard Newsham developed an advanced hand-pumped fire engine. It could throw a stream of water up to 40 yards. New York imported its first Newsham engine in the 1730s. It was about 8 feet long and 6 feet high, narrow enough to be pulled through an alley just 3 feet wide. Its water tank held about 100 gallons of water, usually filled by bucket brigade. Each bucket held 2 to 3 gallons. New York's engine had 3 firefighters on each side. As one side pulled down, the other side went up. Then the other side pulled down to complete the cycle. At 1 cycle per second, the engine pumped out about 72 gallons of water every minute. Unique to the Newsham engine were the treadles that enabled firefighters to stand and pump on them like a modern stepping exercise machine. This movement would be transmitted by thick chains to bow-tie-shaped gears. The gears would then rotate the center shaft, which was also connected to and driven by the pump handles. When used together, the treadles added power to the stroke, increasing the velocity of the stream. Another gear near the pump converted the rotation of the shaft to an up and down motion that drove two piston rods. The pistons were enclosed inside two cylinders. As one piston pulled water into its cylinder, the other expelled water into the compression tank. The air trap at the top of the compression cylinder then acted as a spring that propelled the water out through the nozzle. The Newsham engines, and engines like it, were instrumental in containing big fires in colonial New York and making sure small fires did not turn into large ones.
In 1741, a series of 10 fires gave the newly appointed fire department its first big test. The fires began in March inside the fort in the governor's house. The Newsham engines were on the ground with the first alarm, but hindered by a turbulent wind. The house, the chapel, barracks, and other buildings in the fort were burnt to the ground before the fire was contained. But no one thought the fire had been set. A week later, there was a house fire attributed to a faulty chimney. The Newsham engines were on the scene early and put out the fire. A week later, there was yet another fire at a large warehouse. It was discovered early enough, but some now suspected arson. 3 fires a few days later were clearly not accidental, but arson. The first alarm went up in a cow stable. With early detection, it was easily quenched. Early detection also saved a house with a fire begun in its loft, and the next day, in a haystack near a stable. The very next day, the columns fought 4 fires. The first in a chimney, then the roof of a house, a warehouse, and a baker's cellar. The people of New York, terrified, now looked for more than one arsonist, perhaps a conspiracy. Authorities arrested and tried a multitude of enslaved people and several accused co-conspirators. Panicked colonists did not second-guess the harsh tribunal that executed or banished over 100 of the enslaved and a dozen co-conspirators. For New Yorkers, the fires in 1741 were traumatic, but the ratchet fires could have been worse. The deployment of trained firemen with fire engines and their ability to direct large flows of water had been a crucial factor in limiting the damage. The city bought 2 more engines, appointed 14 more firemen, built firehouses, and expanded the night watch. In the decades that followed, the fire department continued to grow as Britain's conflict with France brought their wars in North America closer to home. To support 25,000 soldiers and 14,000 sailors, the British primed the New York economy as never before. As Benjamin Franklin noted, New York is growing immensely rich by money brought into it for the pay and subsistence of troops. In addition, privateers added to the wealth from the wars. Not part of the regular Navy, privateers sailed old warships and refitted merchant ships to capture enemy cargo ships. Sanctioned by the government, about 100 New York privateers brought the equivalent of $400 million 21st century dollars into the coffers of their investors. Before the wars ended, enriched New Yorkers began to invest in the night watch and the fire department, tripling their numbers by 1770. The fire department not only expanded in size, but as important, refined its organization. The city had historically divided the department's 42 firemen equally among the 6 wards. After the war, Chief Fire Engineer Jacobus Stoutenberg and the city council reorganized the department around individual fire companies rather than by ward. Each engine company had a foreman who managed the deployment of the engine on the fire ground. The foremen, who were themselves veteran firefighters, cultivated and trained cohesive fire companies. This was the form of the department that would last almost a century. It was this trained and highly motivated colonial fire department of about 170 firefighters that saved lives, property, and kept the fires in New York under control in the decade before the
In the
Revolution.
first year of the American Revolution,